When it comes to biblical studies, context is key to understanding the text. In Old Testament studies in particular, gaining an understanding of the cultural context is an important task in accurately handling the word of truth, as Paul admonished Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15. What complicates matters for Old Testament studies is the vast length of time covered by the Old Testament. It is therefore a good idea to narrow down a time period in Israel's history to perform cultural comparison to see if influence exists in either direction between Israel and her neighbors. There were some cultural parallels that existed due to the Hittite influence upon ancient Israel during the time of the Exodus, seen in an understanding of covenant and treaty law and some religious practices. This paper will first examine the identity of Hittites, along with a brief discussion of biblical chronology. The second part of the paper will look at concepts and practices where perhaps cultural influence has occurred. The identity of the Hittites. Now, the great empires of world history often get the focus when doing cultural comparisons. Ancient Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt certainly hold a certain mystique, not to mention a plethora of resources available to the researcher. Others undertake an examination of those peoples closer to Israel, the Canaanites, the Edomites, and the Philistines. But a group of people was noted in the biblical record that remained unrevealed archaeologically until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This group of people is the Hittites. Now, there are almost 50 biblical references to the Hittites, transliterated Hitti, spanning from Genesis to Ezekiel. Such a span of time brings forth the question of whether or not all of these references refer to the same people. For a period of time after the discovery of the Hittite capital of Hattusha in Bagazkoy in Turkey, it was thought that all of these references referred to the same group of people. Now, there are several ways to answer this. First is that the earlier references are anachronistic additions from the period of the Israelite monarchy, and thus they are not the same people. The second is that the groups are the same people, just at different times. Others hold that name is used to refer to a couple of distinct groups. K.L. Null seems to hold to the first position. He references the fact that the biblical authors lived at a time when all memory of origins had been forgotten for some of these groups. He goes on to note that the Hittites were among the groups of people considered native to the land, along with the Canaanites. Kenneth Kitchen argues for the second answer, that the people are the same. First, he remarks, based on the work of M.R. Lehman, on a possible parallel between a certain Hittite law and the events recorded in Genesis 23, where Abraham purchases a field and cave as a burial plot for Sarah from Ephron the Hittite. The Hittite law reference states that when a landholder disposes of only a part of his property to another person, the original and principal landholder must continue to pay all dues on the land. G. Ernest Wright echoes this understanding and identifies the dues as certain feudal services, which are not made clear. Hoffner, however, calls this understanding into question. He remarks that while it might be possible for the Hittite laws in question to date as far back as the time of Abraham, it is too much to assume that these specific laws should be generalized. Law 46 is in regards to land that is inherited, and Law 47 to land belonging to craftsmen. Kitchen goes on to note Hittite intervention in the political sphere of Syria in the early 2nd millennium and an Anatolian presence at Byblos. Based on that evidence, he states that limited Anatolian penetration of Phoenicia and Palestine can be found quite early. In response, Hoffner points out that the political intervention by the Hittites never went south of northern Syria, and the name evidence at Byblos only shows once again northern Syria and the coastal regions. Both of these groups focus on the idea of an incursion of a group of people into the land of Canaan. However, no one has focused on the idea that an individual or family unit migrated from Anatolia into the land of Canaan, and in the specific context of Genesis 23, purchased land, much as Abraham migrated into the area from Ur. This would make it difficult to ascertain influences early in the history of Israel. Hoffner falls into the third category, as does Keller when he states, on the contrary, we now have two categories of Hittites, those in the Bible and the others whose presence in Asia Minor has been proved by archaeology. Now, this third concept is perhaps the most likely answer to who the Hittites were. In the early history of Canaan, the Hittites are associated with the people of the land and have West Semitic names. In the later period of Israelite history, during the time of the monarchy, the Hittite empire had long fallen, though its influence and perhaps people existed in the kingdoms of northern Syria who were identified as Hittites. This leaves the period of the Hittite Empire, 1400 to 1200 BC, to explore. The question then arises as to which period of Israel's history lines up with that of the Hittite Empire. Ehrlich has the Exodus from Egypt occurring in the middle of the 13th century BC. This general time period is echoed by Orlinsky. Keller is even more specific in dating the Exodus to about 1290 BC. In recent times, David Rohl has proposed a new way of dating ancient Egyptian history. According to this revised chronology, Rohl places the Exodus occurring in 1447 BC. Rohl is not without his critics. This dating would place the Exodus as occurring just before the Hittite Empire, which would still allow for some cultural interactions between Anatolia and Egypt, though not as much as later periods. Rather, the parallels that follow provide further evidence for the traditional dating of the Exodus rather than an earlier one. Cultural parallels between the Hittites and Israel. Now, there can be no doubt that there are some cultural parallels or influences from the Anatolian Hittite to Israelite culture. And considering the nature of these parallels, they most likely occurred during the time period of the Exodus. They are mainly in the area of literature, law, and religious practice. The first major area that receives the most attention is in the realm of covenant and treaty. It has been noted that the Hittite treaties found in the archaeological record are similar in structure to the biblical texts that record the covenants. This is especially true for the covenant sections of the book of Deuteronomy and the renewal of the covenant in Joshua. Suzerainty treaties from before the period of the Hittite Empire and those afterwards during the first millennium BC are markedly different from that during the empire. There are several structural similarities. Hittite suzerainty treaties from this period, roughly 1344 to 1271 BC, were generally composed of 6 sections. 1, an introduction of the speaker, 2, a historical prologue, 3, stipulations of the treaty, 4, a statement regarding the document itself, 5, a witness section, usually divine, and 6, a section detailing curses for failing to uphold the requirements and blessing for fulfilling them. Some of these sections are present in treaties from all time periods. Some are relatively rare, at least in the archaeological record. Walton provides a thorough breakdown for the comparison between the treaties and the biblical texts. The introduction of the speaker occurs across a range of time and from a variety of locations. Biblical examples include Exodus 20 verse 1, Deuteronomy 1 verses 1 through 5, Joshua 24 verses 1 through 2. The historical prologue is considered fairly unique to the Hittite treaties. Biblical examples include Exodus 20 verse 2, Deuteronomy 1 verses 6 through 3, and 1:6 through 3:29, and Joshua 24 chapters 2 through verses 2 through 13. The stipulation section is perhaps the heart of the treaty, as they're found in all examples. In Exodus, the stipulations can be seen in the Decalogue and the Covenant Code. In Deuteronomy, chapters 4 through 26 are considered stipulations. Leviticus 1 through 25 records the ritual instructions, which some consider to be stipulations. Joshua 24, verse 14 through 15 are the stipulations of that section. The statement regarding the document only appears in Hittite treaties, though it is missing in some of those. Biblical examples of this structural component would be Exodus 25, verse 16, Deuteronomy 27, verses 2 and 3, and Joshua 24, verse 26. The witness section is standard for all treaties at all times. Deuteronomy 31, 19 through 22 has a song composed by Moses at God's instruction to serve as a witness. In Deuteronomy 31, verses 26 through 28, the heavens and the earth are recorded as being witness for this covenant. In Joshua 24, verse 22, the people themselves are witnesses, and the stone is a witness as well. The curses blessing section is not unique to Hittite treaties or the biblical record. However, the majority of treaties do feature a curse section, with blessings being rarer. Leviticus 26, verses 1 through 33 showcase the blessings and cursings. Deuteronomy 28 holds the blessings cursings section for that book. Kitchen asserts that because of these similarities in form, the Sinai covenant corresponds to the late second millennium treaties and not to those of the first millennium. Tiger Cohen notes that while scholarship moved away from this assessment, it is now moving back. These treatments show that there are too many similarities to dismiss the possibility of an inherited knowledge of the political treaty tradition. She goes further, though, and points out that the Hittite term for treaty goes beyond that of a simple political document, and instead had a larger understanding in the ancient world that it was a document that was intended to create and maintain loyalty between the parties, namely the king and the god, or the serving class and the king. She concludes with this thought: the biblical writers did not adopt the issue form as such. Instead, they received the concept that lies at its base, with occasional similar use of terminology and phraseology. Instructions and treaty texts were an inherent part of the legal knowledge of the scribes. Both Hittite and Israelite societies had a divine order that is reflected in their administrative organization. Thus, the form of the covenant treaty followed the function of creating a basis for loyalty and its maintenance. Now, a similar area of parallel is that of law. Many of the stipulation sections mentioned above can be considered to fall within this category. Alt divided law into two main groups, apodictic and casuistic. Livingston states that apodictic laws in the Old Testament can be clearly seen in the Ten Commandments, but are also found elsewhere, noting that the closest Hittite parallels are political in nature. He also goes on to say that Israelite laws, in comparison to other ancient Near Eastern laws, including that of the Hittites, were much more humane. Matthews and Benjamin present a slightly different understanding concerning the Hittite laws between 1450 and 1200 BC. They assert a lessening of sentences from previous laws, preferring compensation over punishment, corporal punishment over death, and fines over corporal punishment. They go on to note the parallels between these Hittite laws, casuistic, and the biblical record, namely from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, including similar terminology and covenant sealing practices. They present 10 examples of parallelism between the Hittite and biblical law codes. One is that of Hittite Law 10 and Exodus 21, verses 18 through 19. From the Hittite Law 10. If one citizen beats another so that the victim becomes an invalid, then the assailant shall take care of the victim. The assailant shall also pay someone to look after the victim's house until he recovers. When the victim recovers, the assailant shall give him 3 1/2 ounces of silver and pay his medical bills. From Exodus 21, verses 18 through 19, New American Standard Version. If men have a quarrel and one strike the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. Now, Hoffner highlights the similarities in these passages. The injury is temporary. The loss of time is compensated. The cost of medical care is also compensated. The loss of time from Exodus may imply more than merely paying for lost time. The Hittite law has the assailant providing someone to fill in for the injured man and pay a fine to him afterwards. The Hittite law is clearer than the biblical example concerning medical care. Livingston also notes a law concerning levirate marriage. This possibly refers to Hittite Law 193. If a citizen dies, then his legal guardian, Hittite brother, marries his widow. If a citizen and his legal guardian die, then the citizen's father marries his widow. There are other cultural parallels that have been noted by scholars. Hoffner cites Jacob Milgram as pointing out that the two classes of temple guards mentioned in the Hittite instructions for priests correspond in function rather closely to the biblical priests and Levites. Hoffner also notes a similar practice among the Hittites, as that found in Leviticus 16 concerning the scapegoat, where an animal bore away sin and impurity after ritual magic. He also notes that there were some cultural words common to both Israel and the Hittites, as well as a similarity in some language between a couple of Hittite texts in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 through 4. Conclusion. An examination of cultural parallels between ancient Israel and the Hittites requires first identifying the Hittites. While the issue of which people group the Hittites mentioned in the Bible belong to continues to be discussed, modern scholarship leans toward identifying the early Hittites of Genesis with a people group native to the land in Canaan, different from the Anatolian Hittites, whose empire stretched roughly 1450 to 1200 BC. References to Hittites during the period of the monarchy are more than likely to the kingdoms that developed in northern Syria out of the old Hittite Empire. When one is discussing the archaeological evidence and possible cultural parallels with the Hittites, one is naturally drawn to the high period of Hittite history, the empire. The period of Israel that existed at this time, based upon the traditional chronology, is that of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. The evidence supports cultural influence or parallel for Israel at this time, perhaps through Moses' presence in the Egyptian court and possible nearness to international political discussions. The evidence presented here includes parallels between the form of the biblical covenant and the form of Hittite suzerainty treaties, parallels in casuistic law, and possible parallels in language and religious practice. These parallels, while not entirely unique to the Hittites or to Israel, do point to the fact that some cultural interchange occurred. They also uphold the traditional dating of events like the Exodus, as it would be difficult for this influence to occur earlier in the second millennium or later in the first millennium BC. Perhaps more parallels or areas of influence can be identified as archaeological work continues in Anatolia, Israel, and other areas of the Near East as Hittite scholarship progresses.